Good afternoon. My name is Michael Morris. I'm the Superintendent of Schools here in Amherst, Massachusetts, and thank you for joining us for our stream. I want to talk a little bit about the origin of the stream. About a month ago, I was talking to one of our panelists, and we were talking a bit about this situation, about school closures, about COVID-19, and about the vast and unevenly distributed implications that would have on students, and what could be done to mitigate them. And we stopped and we realized that given the current situation, given K-12 education and higher education's current state of reactiveness based on the public health crisis, that there weren't enough conversations happening between researchers and practitioners, and that we had an educational crisis as well as a public health crisis. So we thought maybe having another researcher on and having a more public dialogue would be helpful, and we hope you agree as you're on today. Start with a quote from the Japanese novelist Haruki Murakami. "And once the storm is over, you won't remember how you made it through or how you managed to survive. But one thing is certain, when you come out of the storm, you won't be the same person who walked in. That's what the storm is all about." And for me and for us, the impacts of the storm of COVID-19 in the short and medium term will undoubtedly have a long-term implications on the education and the future of our students. And returning to normal is not something that I feel like is going to happen anytime soon. It's not a paradigm I think is appropriate for many years, even once the public health crisis is thwarted. So the goal of today's event is to promote dialogue, to push forward conversations about what K-12 education will look like during and after the storm. Town manager in my town in Amherst recently used this Winston Churchill quote to describe where we are with COVID. "Now is not the end. It's not even the beginning of the end, but it is perhaps the end of the beginning." I think that's accurate for where we are, and I think it's the perfect time to have the conversation and start having more conversations between researchers and practitioners. No one has all the answers right now. You're not going to get all the answers from the panel from us today, and there's no playbook for this scenario, but we're looking to engender the type of dialogue and creative thinking and development of ideas that will be so essential for our nation's students now and in the future. As such, the live chat feature is enabled, and we hope that all of you watching will use it. We'll be breaking the session into sections, and we want this to be as interactive as possible. So please utilize that feature throughout today's session. I'm quite fortunate to have two researchers with me who contribute to the dialogue. We've had numerous conversations over the last couple of weeks and really informed my thinking, and I think really helpful to inform many practitioners' thinking about next steps as we enter uncharted waters. So the first is Katie McDermitt. Katie is a professor in the College of Education and the School of Public Policy at UMass Amherst. She is also the chair of the Department of Educational Policy, Research, and Administration. And our other panelist is Michael Lovenheim. He is the Donald C. Poterney 74 chair in the Department of Economics at Cornell University. So thank you so much for our ongoing dialogue with both of you, and thank you so much for coming on the show today. And just want to give the opportunity for Katie and Mike to share anything that they think they'd like to share before we get rolling with some of the dialogue.
Well, hi, everybody, and thank you for, at least in Western Massachusetts, being indoors on a beautiful day, listening to this. I'm a political scientist by training. I do research on the connections between education policy and educational inequality and equality. And I'm in the last 3 weeks of my career of having kids in K-12 school. So it's been an interesting month at my house.
Great. Hi, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. So it is similarly very nice here in upstate New York. So thank you for tuning in and being indoors. I am an economist by training. As Mike said, I am in the economics department at Cornell, as well as in the School of Industrial and Labor Relations and in the Department of Policy Analysis and Management. I do work generally in K-12 and higher education policy issues in the economics of education, with a particular focus on both the role of resources in driving student decisions about how much to invest in an education, as well as the effect of different educational decisions students make on future outcomes like labor market outcomes and earnings.
Great. Thank you both again for being here. And we wanted to start, we have a set of 4 questions, and, as in much dialogue between practitioners and researchers, they're related, they're not the same, but they're all related questions. And again, I want to encourage folks to use the chat feature as we go. But the first question, more simply, was what are some of the long-term costs of schooling missed during the pandemic? One of the unique parts of this particular situation is that schools closed for months on end across our country. When we think of other natural disasters, for instance, it's more localized than across the country. And this is unique for our country anyway in recent years. And I think so much energy has gone, rightfully so, into how do we salvage as much as we can this spring. And certainly as a practitioner, I think I know I've seen tremendous amount of energy of teachers, staff members, administrators go to that. And I think we're at the time to pause and talk about those long-term costs of the missed schooling and think about what other models might we use to compare this unique situation to. So I want to open it up for our research panel to jump into that dialogue.
Katie, if you want to start, you can, or I can.
I have just in front of me some bits of information from a recent survey that the newspaper Education Week did within the past month. And it's interesting that the teachers they surveyed say that their workday's only gotten about an hour shorter, even though they say that their kids are getting about 3 hours of learning time every day. So what that suggests to me is that teachers are doing, at least an hour offline for every hour that they're doing actually presenting material to students. But as far as thinking about the long-term costs in terms of educational attainment of the pandemic, the teachers say that they're spending less time presenting new concepts, that they're doing a lot of review, and that's particularly true of teachers who are working in high poverty schools. And they also report that many of their students are disengaged, and there was a higher proportion of students disengaged the second time that Education Week did the survey than the first time that Education Week did the survey. And about a quarter of students are sort of online truant in the sense that their teachers aren't seeing or hearing from them. So that makes me think of something that researchers know a lot about, which is referred to as summer slide, the ground that kids lose academically over summer vacation. And, summer slide would really kind of be the best case scenario, right? If kids came back to school in the fall and they're only as far behind as they would have been just from summer vacation. So it could be really quite bad.
Yeah, I like to think about this from, in some sense, like the long-term perspective of, what are the costs going to look like 30 years from now, 40 years from now, if we do nothing, right? And one of the dominant trends in society, particularly the U.S. Economy over the past 30 years or so, is a shift towards more of a skill-based economy. A lot of us have probably heard a lot about that, right? Where increasingly to get a high-paying job, be in the middle class or above, it requires more education, right? Because that's a core way we get these skills that are valued in the labor market, and in particular, a labor market that is more skill-based. And so, the cost to society of this pandemic, if we do nothing to address the lost education, could be enormous, right? So kind of the back of the envelope number that economists often use to think about, the economic return to a year of education is about 10%, right? So, on average, an extra year of education increases your future wages by about 10. And we think that reflects, productivity, right? You're earning more because you're a more productive worker. And so if you think about it, students are losing up to maybe a half a year of education or more by the time this is all over. When you multiply that through every single student in the United States through their entire working life, it's an enormous amount of money, and it's an enormous amount of productivity, right? We're losing. It's not just about, counting the money. It's about thinking about how productive our workforce is. And so I think the long-term costs here are absolutely enormous. And I think one of the problems we face is that the benefits from remediating this are way in the future, right? In terms of the productivity of the workforce, but the costs need to be incurred now. And if we don't do something soon about it, it's going to be very problematic in the long run, because these things are harder to deal with, when students are older, right? We want to try to use the schooling system and the educational system to handle this problem rather than waiting for when, people are actually in the workforce and, it's harder to deliver skills to them.
Yeah, and one of the things on a practitioner side that I worry a lot about, something that Katie mentioned, was the disengagement. And for some students, there's not the on-off switch. It might be a very slow dimmer. in terms of re-engaging with academic work, re-engaging with being with groups of people. As students, there's the academic side and this being in school, but there's also for many students, the social side, and not just the social emotional side, but literally the social learning that happens in school. And so there's concerns I have on a practitioner level that complement what you're saying, that really do, I worry about students not re-engaging, even when it's safe to be back in school. I think the other thing that some articles that that were shared with me by my researcher partners talked about, particularly in mathematics, the expected loss or expected retention of content, like best case scenario being on average 50% of what a typical year's growth would be. And to have huge concerns about math being a very cumulative subject area, and being a gateway, to your point, Mike, about future careers and jobs. How do you make up for that? And is that the right paradigm even to use to make up for it? How do you address a year where a significant, all of the students to varying degrees have not gained all the content knowledge that they would typically gain in a year? And that's a unique problem that we're facing. And there's been individuals, you think of students who have accidents, that, it's not that it's novel to think about an individual level, but on a kind of district, state, national level, how to address those needs. And I don't see, and maybe I'm not reading the right thing, I don't see that being as much the focus. And I think it's because we're all in reactive mode. It's not because of the lack of best intentions by our state or other folks, but really getting into the curricular side. How are we going to make up for that? Because the stakes, as you said, both of you said, are so high.
Yeah.
And unevenly distributed as well. That I like to tell students in my education policy class that any generalizations about public education in the United States that anybody makes are likely to be inaccurate for most places most of the time, because it's a hugely diverse system. There's huge variety in who's in the system, and the same kinds of people, low-income people, essential workers, immigrants, African Americans, that we're often not serving well in our public schools anyway, those are the people who the pandemic is hitting the hardest. So, kids in those communities aren't just missing out on the school, they're likelier than other kids to be having much more difficult experiences at home when they're not in school.
Right. And I think this is one reason why the summer slide, as you were talking about, Katie, is kind of a best case scenario, right? As we've talked about before, because of the fact that some students are learning a lot and are in either our districts or households where there's a lot of learning going on, and some are not. And that's likely to, the students who are going to be struggling the most are the most disadvantaged students, right? And so over the summer, very few students are actually in school, right? And so students differentially kind of lose knowledge over the summer, but because no one's expected to be in school, we wouldn't expect it to be, as large a difference. But here, some students are actually, moving forward, and a lot of students are not. And that's likely not happening evenly across the socioeconomic distribution, right? And so this is going to, almost unquestionably exacerbate inequality in really dramatic ways that are going to require some policies to address, right, by state governments and the federal government, I think, as well as individual districts. But I think this we'll probably get to. There are strong constraints about what individual districts can actually do in this environment, right? Because I think any real way to address these issues is going to be expensive, right, and far beyond the means of any one district to really address.
Yeah, I'll say on the practitioner side, one thing that won't address the larger picture, but one thing that we are, and by we, I mean practitioners, not just, me and my particular job, have benefited from is the federal government did relax some of its rules on how much Title I money can be moved from one year to the next. So usually there's a cap on, if you don't spend 1 year, there's a cap on how much can be transferred to the next year. And they removed that cap. And since we were spending much less this spring on Title I resources, we are able to offer more resources to our summer program. Now, our summer program in that way for ELL and Title I students at elementary level is going to be virtual, but we're talking about working with 1 to 3 students in a much different way than we would typically. Usually our summer program's more students, and it's it doesn't have the same intensive focus. And one of the things that a very strong educator in our district said when we started talking about this is the first thing we have to do is actually understand where they are. And that's true no matter what your summer program or fall, but I think in this case, trying to get a sense of where students are at the beginning of July, I think it's hard to estimate where that is, much more than a typical year where we have many, many years experience of being able to predict what summer learning loss is or what happens at the end of the school year before summer school. And I think that was a really valid point in trying to think about what assessments can we use to help drive our instruction in a small group setting, because exactly what you said, we're anticipating a much wider variation on student readiness for the next grade level than we would in a typical year, which has huge, in my practitioner lens, huge implications for what we actually do and how we structure school next year, even separate from the public health guidance, which I know we'll get to a little bit later. But I think, it's shifting resources is the current policy, seems like, position of the federal government, for the most part, or allowing us to shift resources we've already been granted. I think there's going to be some larger interventions that are hopefully come to play, because I think there's going to be some limitations on what we can do with existing funds.
Right, and I think, it's helpful to just try to get a bit of the scope of this problem, right? So if we think that students, let's say, have missed a half a year of schooling, right? We have to make up that half of year of schooling. We have to pay to do that. We can't just do that for free. It's not like school districts are sitting on extra funding that would just let them do stuff, right? It would be negligent for them to have done that, right? Where are these reserves coming from? It's not about financial mismanagement or any of those issues. Not that, I'm sure not in Amherst Pelham Regional Schools, that's not happening, but in some school districts, money is mismanaged. But that's not the reason why we don't have the money to do this. The reason is we have to invent another half a year of schooling somewhere, right? And that's going to take resources to, pay teachers, administrators, bus drivers, cafeteria workers, right? All the people who service schools, need to be paid for the time that they're going to be working. And that's going to be very expensive to do, right? And so it's not really about, I think it's great that the federal government's letting school districts be more flexible, but I don't think that's anywhere near the right way to think about this problem. The way to think about this problem is students have lost some, large fraction of a year of schooling, and we need to find a way to make that up to them, right? So whether that comes from, lengthened school years, lengthened school days, right? There's many ways to think about how we might do that. And then when we add in the point you made, Mike, which is that students are going to be in much different places when we re-enter school, right? And so then schools are going to have to deal with the added difficulty of how to bring the students who fell behind up to speed while still not, boring the students who are on grade level or above, right? And so the variation across students is going to widen, particularly within a certain grade, right? And so that creates additional challenges. And so, I'm not trying to just be negative. I am a dismal scientist, but I do think we do need to look this in the eye here, right? And say, what is really the problem we have that we need, the policy problem that we need to overcome? Right. And I think the policy problem we need to overcome from the education sphere is students are losing a lot of learning, and that learning is going to be, that loss is going to be extraordinarily detrimental to them and to society in the long run, unless we do something about it, soon. And that's going to take a large volume of resources outside of the scope of things the federal government in particular could do, right? We're not talking about $300 trillion or something, right? We're talking about levels of funding that I think the federal government could stomach, and certainly is in line with some of the recent stimulus packages that they've passed, but focused on education.
Yeah. So we have a couple comments and questions. Why don't we
Great.
Some of those, we like those. So Lauren asks, how can we extrapolate from the students who receive summer support to the general population? Many students will be by design will not be in this programs. So I think just to give a little local context, we're doing a lot of outreach, and I think the point is well taken that no matter what outreach we do, for some students accessing even virtual programming, even if they have Wi-Fi and or a hotspot or a Chromebook, is not necessarily going to be possible given other responsibilities and other factors in their homes. So what I really like about this question, I'd love to pick your brain about one of the things I'm taking from even the question is, how do we frame our summer services so we learn from it and actually informs our work in the fall? So I'd love to hear your perspectives on that, or your thoughts about how districts and states could think about using that as almost a laboratory.
I'm going to look right at the economist here. It sounds like
oh gosh, I was looking at you. That's a good question.
We definitely evaluate it, right?
Yes. Well, all evaluation is hard in this environment, right? Because, what we'd love is like a randomized controlled trial or something like that. That's not going to happen, and nor really should it right now. I do think this is some of the lessons from summer support we can glean just from sharing information, right? And I think this is actually true when we move beyond the summer and go into the fall and hopefully restart schools, which is that all schools, or a lot of schools, are going to do things differently, right? States are going to have different policies. Different school districts are going to implement things in different ways. And I think we need to really be very transparent about what we're doing and about what the outcomes are so that we can study the different policies, right? We're going to have different policy variation, just that naturally arises because people are going to have different ideas about how to recover from this pandemic. And so I think, one of the key things is that, we need to have data on what's happening. We need to share information across schools. And hopefully, as a researcher, I'd say with researchers, who can help interpret those data and really learn from each other, right? What are the best practices here? And, how do we communicate that to one another and, roll this out more generally, right? And I think that is, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I'll also make a plug, since I'm mostly a qualitative researcher, that it's, I think, also going to be important to hear from the kids, the older kids, and the parents who are participating in these programs to get a sense of what feels accessible and doable. I know that in my role as a department chair, from listening to our graduate students, I've learned things about their situations that I wouldn't have understood if I hadn't actually heard them from a participant. So I think, a combination of how an economist viewed this and how a more qualitative evaluator would view it is probably worth doing.
Yeah, I agree. Completely. And let me also say, I think a lot of this is, it's hard, but we all need to be kind of humble here in the sense of like, the more dogma we approach these questions and issues with, the harder it's going to be to learn from our mistakes, to learn from the data, right? And to learn from each other. And I think we should just all take a step back and remember, this is uncharted territory for everybody. We're all groping around to try to figure out what to do. And in that environment, right, some people are gonna make mistakes. Some people are gonna happen upon, really good stuff. And we shouldn't be, I would hope that as the policy community, we can all kind of get together and say, we're going to try things, and if they don't work, we'll move on to the next thing, but try not to be dogmatic about our responses, because I think then we, dig on our heels, and nobody really knows what to do here, right? I think that's it's hard to say, but it's true. We've just never been in this situation before, right? The last time we had a pandemic on this order was 1918, and that was before the Common School movement, right? So we didn't have compulsory schooling back then. So we literally don't know how to do this because it's never happened, in modern times. And by modern, I mean after we've had compulsory schooling. And so in that sense, like, it's not a failure that we don't know what to do. It's just and so because of that, we need to be open to new ways of doing things and to learn from each other. And I think as a policy person, that's exciting, right, to learn these new lessons. But it's also a daunting challenge, and why I'm happy I have my job and not Mike's job.
So
I could say that, right?
Yeah. Let me. I'm going to scroll down. There's a couple questions. Some are probably longer response than other, but this one, getting to unanswerable questions. How do we make up half a year at school? How do we approach learning in a completely different way? How to prioritize what students learn? I think this is the question, right? And if people have ideas, please feel free to put them in the comments too. As I said at the beginning, not all the answers are going to be on this call, at least not from the three of us. What I would say, what we're doing locally, and I can share that, is that at the elementary level, for instance, I was in a meeting in the last week with principals and some of our math specialists, whose role it is to really help teachers with their math curriculum. And we asked them to stop doing what they're doing, which was many, many things to make distance learning go well, and actually start crafting what a curriculum map would look like for the next academic year. Without the explicitly without the goal, of catching up and doing a year and a half and a year's worth, because we know that that's going to be, there's no evidence that's a good strategy. But really to think about starting to develop a multi-year plan of how would you address these learning standards that weren't explicitly taught to all students in the typical way from March 13th in our case until September. We're starting to do similar work in literacy. So one of the things that I found when I looked it up is, there's not great models to do this in a large scale way, like in a whole class way. You could look at reading recovery and other interventions that do this on a very individualized basis. So I do think a multi-year approach is going to be required. But I think if students walk in day one and we're teaching the 5th grade curriculum on the first day of school and students haven't been in school, nor have they had explicit teaching in the last quarter of the year or in the same way, that's not going to be a recipe for success. So I don't know if either of you have things you want to add about the making up half a year piece.
Well, there was when we talked yesterday, we realized there's this tension in the literature because there's research on extending learning time, which suggests that that's good and that helps students learn more. But then, Mike, I know you've done research on grade retention, which points in not quite the opposite direction, but in a different direction.
Yeah. So the evidence on grade retention suggests that particularly in older students holding them back. So you're talking about like 8th graders, right? So many districts and states have regulations that you have to pass high stakes exams before you move on to 9th grade. And the evidence is that the students who fail those exams and are held back, relative to students who just pass, so like students who differ by a couple points, that they do worse. The students who fail, and we think a lot of that is just it's disruptive to be held back, right? That there are social gains that are happening in school as well, and that students actually just disengage with learning in ways that kind of align with some of the concerns Mike was raising earlier. So. Right, we haven't ever had the experience where we've held such a large group of people back, right? That might be different in this environment, right? If we decide to only move some students to the next grade, that might not be a generalizable finding. And the other piece of this is that it seems like holding students back in earlier grades does not have the deleterious impacts that holding them back in older grades or higher grades has, but it doesn't also seem to have positive effects either. So it's more neutral in the long run. So I think grade retention is tricky, but it doesn't from the literature, for the research we have, does not seem like it's a panacea by any measure, and is something we should approach with some trepidation, right? Because of some of the evidence. I mean, I would argue that we kind of either need to extend the school day or extend the school year, or some combination, right? It's about time. We need more time in school because the students lost the time, right? And so, I mean, it sounds straightforward. It's hard to do, right? And this is where, academics can say, oh, we just need more time. And, practitioners like Mike will be like, are you crazy? But I think it's, if we had the resources to produce a longer school day, a longer school year, it wouldn't be as big a problem to do, right? And so that's, as an economist, I hate to keep coming back to resources, although that's my training, and so I'll do it. I'll play to type. But I think like those are kind of the most straightforward in a sense ways to address this problem. I think trying to cram in the lost learning into existing school days is going to be very, very challenging. I am skeptical that would work, because I just don't think, it's not like there's a lot of slack in those days, right? Schools are teaching students all day long, and I just don't know how you make up a half day of school or a half year of school without more time.
I guess, and also just probably important to be flexible about how any of this happens. One weird, I wouldn't call it a silver lining, but at least in this instance, the students everybody missed the last third of the school year, so that you could start a 5th grade class with the content that's, roughly toward the end of what you might have been teaching in 4th grade in a normal year. And you can just do that and call it 5th grade and not pin the stigma on some kids of, your neighbor's in 5th grade, but you're still a 4th grader, because everybody's not going to be in the same place, but everybody does have that common experience of the educational disruption.
I'm going to go through a couple questions. I'm just going to roll through before we transition. Some are great segues to the next topic. How are schools taking attendance, and what the local data say about that? And I think schools are taking attendance lots. I think it's a good actually conversation, because schools are taking attendance in really different ways, because there isn't one way that you would typically do that. And the state has told us that attendance is one of our accountability markers in Massachusetts, and they're like, everything after March 13th doesn't count. Because of all the factors. And in my district, we take it both in terms of what's being done digitally, in terms of live, like we use Google, so Google Meets, but also asynchronous work that gets handed in. And any student who's not engaging, we have a kind of decision tree that goes to the principal, the counselor, our family center, to try to access which students are participating, which aren't. And that feels really different in 12th grade. Just because of the age of students. So there's some acknowledgement of that as well. There's a really good comment about the trauma students are experiencing, and that absolutely has to be managed. And we actually have work groups now working, what's next fall going to look like academically. And we have a specific group working. Actually, we have one group on the mental health and social emotional needs of students. We have another one on staff support, because I think it's been traumatic for everybody involved. And that absolutely has to be part of our planning. And people who want to tune in back, we're going to have a session in early June with someone who's a psychologist who's going to help talk and help families about how do we talk to children about the fall when we don't know what the fall is going to look like, and starting to support families in that way. So great question. And we'll come back to that sometime soon. I think it's June, whatever that Wednesday is. I think it's June 3rd. Some of these other questions we're going to address in terms of the federal role in funding extra learning time and community-based. So I'm going to come back to those. They're spot on. This is an interesting one I do want to address, at least from the practitioner lens. If there are students who are digitally truant, again, that's not my practitioner term, to be really clear. It's not how I frame it, but I understand the terming that the periodical or the author used. I think one of the things that we found in our district is students' ability to access online learning looks really different in small groups versus the whole group. So when you have kids of any age, one of the things that we've heard is when there's smaller groups, when there's 4 to 5 students find a lot more value in the digital learning that happens, and they're much more willing to access the digital learning. When it's 20 students and the ability to engage and participate is low, particularly, I think it mirrors the in-person environment, but I think it magnifies it. It's a real challenge for many students to engage in a group of 24 students taking a high school course. If they're doing a 4 and 5 student, the accountability can be much higher. The teacher can check in and assess learning as they go. So it's a good question. We're going to find out this summer if there's a difference, but we perceive, based on even teachers experimenting with different office hour models in our district this spring, that there's a distinct difference when it's small group versus large group. I'm just going to pull up this one. Some of the strategies for addressing learning loss could have been tossed around. Creating half grades could also increase academic tracking. Is that a worry? Are there ways around that? That's a big question. We could probably spend the next, we got about an hour left, spend that time on. But I think from the practitioner viewpoint, this goes back to the trauma that we're very conscious of, that students to be able to access the learning experiences that they need to have, that they have to be fully able to be emotionally engaged in the work. And they're going to be highly, I find our students here, and I think it's true everywhere, they're really quick to read the intent, their perceived intent, which is often the real intent of the adults around them, and the decisions the adults made about them. And so it's certainly something that we're conscious of, and I think we have to marry the academic needs of students given this situation, particularly I use Gloria Lassen-Billings' term of educational debt. I know other people use achievement gap, to be able to talk about this with what do we need to do so students are able to access the learning, right? And there's no good formula that I know of yet to consider that. I don't know if Katie or Mike want to jump into that question, but I think it is a tough one.
Yeah, I did want to jump in with just something that came up in one of our preliminary conversations, which is that you would probably want to do flexible grouping, at least with younger kids as they're catching up in math and reading. But we'll probably talk more about the CDC guidelines in a couple minutes. if you look at what the Centers for Disease Control are recommending for keeping a school environment safe, they explicitly say to keep the same little pod of about 15 kids together all day long, which is not particularly compatible with flexible grouping.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about the policy problem here, that kids are going to come back to school and within a grade, they're going to be at much different places than they were beforehand, right? The variation across students in where they are academically is going to widen. There's kind of three options, right? One is, and you can choose some combination of them, but one is do nothing, and then you have to teach a class. You have teachers teaching classes where the variation across students is much larger in terms of where they are, and that's challenging. You can track students, that has benefits and costs, and or you can retain students, and we already talked about that, right? So the who are far below grade level. I think as Katie mentioned, this kind of flexible grouping model seems like it gets at a lot of the benefits of tracking without necessarily fixing kids in place, right, and allowing basically adaptive growth in what groups you're in. But then that has public health concerns potentially, depending on how it's done. So I think I just keep coming back to, it's a really hard problem. So we learned here, but it is a very challenging problem. I mean, part of it too is like there's no perfect solution, right? And where individuals or school districts or parents come down on which of those options seem least distasteful or most exciting, I think there's going to be a lot of variation in who does what, and I think that's also an opportunity to study this, right? That as a scholar, I'm very interested in, because I think that we're going to be able to learn a lot about what the right way to reintroduce kids to schools if something like this happens again, from what schools do when we do come back.
Yeah, there's a couple comments that actually segue us, I think, to the next kind of large area, which is what to do, right? We've sort of touched on that, but what are some policy things both at, there's a, about programming with the Federal Department of Education, what should be looking at the local level. There's another comment that's, families are asking districts to start talking about the fall, and, especially with the CDC guidance, which is about essentially not having students mix with other students as much as possible at the elementary level. That's a lot more feasible, and it gets progressively more challenging. The middle school level, it's less feasible. At the high school level, it's particularly challenging. So I'm trying to think of the best way we're doing this live, right? It's unscripted. So I'm trying to think of the best way to organize the conversation, and whether we start from the local and go up to the federal, or vice versa. I don't know if you had thoughts about that, because we certainly intend to address both. I don't know, Mike or Katie, where you'd like to.
I guess it's interesting because the problems kind of roll up from the local level, and the money kind of is going to have to roll down from the federal level.
Yeah.
And because the federal government, as it's been doing, is in a position to deficit spend, and states and localities, I think there's one state that doesn't have to balance its budget, but I can never remember which one it is. And then local communities also have to balance their budgets. So I'm not sure how many different ways we can come up with to say more federal spending, but
yes.
Actually, Mike, those numbers you had earlier today were really interesting. If you've got them handy.
Yeah, I'm happy to share. So
yeah,
I just went through to some of the different federal bills that have been passed and thought about comparing them to what was done in the Great Recession. So just to give you a just scale here about what we're talking about, the height of the Great Recession for unemployment was October 2009, and the unemployment rate was 10%. Now, there's other measures of how bad things were that's not just the unemployment rate, but it's a nice way to think about it. Currently, the unemployment rate sits at about 15%. It's 14.7, and growing. So, this is a lot worse. And I think the other thing to remember when I'm about to say these numbers is that in the Great Recession, schools didn't shut down. Right? Kids didn't miss learning days. I mean, some students did because of economic hardship, and that was important. But it's not like, all students in the U.S. were out of school for 3 to 6 months, right? So, this is a deeper recession and has more direct implications for education than the Great Recession had. So, currently, the CARES Act which is the only act that was that was signed into law, and that was the most recent one that was signed into law, has financing for education that totals about $27 billion. So that's the amount that the federal government has allocated to directly help education, both K-12 and higher ed, and it's split about evenly. The HEROES Act, which is the May 15th act that the House passed, but that does not look like, from everything we've seen, like it has much legs in the Senate or with the White House, that has another $90 billion. So that would bring us up to $120 billion if that were passed. In the Great Recession, the American Reinvestment and Recovery Act, ARRA, had in real terms now $130 billion, right? So in a weaker recession or in a less dramatic recession that had less implications for education, we spent currently, there was 130 billion and currently we're at 27 billion. So it's very different. And so I think that's just important to kind of have a sense of what the scope is of what the government's done in the past. And as well, like the research on the Great Recession is that money went a long way to help shield school districts. But even then it wasn't enough. That lower income school districts, or school districts that serve more disadvantaged children, school districts that rely more on state funding, saw declines in spending, even with that support by the federal government, and that those students in those school districts experience learning losses, right? And so, even with a large, when the federal government did step in with a lot of money, it helped, but it wasn't enough. And here they so far have not stepped in with anything close to that amount of money. And I think the problem here is a lot worse than it was in the Great Recession. Yeah,
and I think to hop on that theme, one of the conversations that I had with the Amherst School Committee last night is we're in budget, and our budget looks different than it did in March, and that's true for every district that I know of. And one of the challenges is that we talked about budget directly after we talked about COVID-19 and thinking about fall, and the juxtaposition of thinking about fall, the CDC guidance that's going to have very small numbers, relatively small numbers of students in classrooms, the guidance on how many students can be on a bus, all that came out last weekend, the juxtaposition of that and then reducing our budget was a hard conversation. And it wasn't just hard in the immediate sense. It was hard because many of my school committee members noted that there's probably rarely a time in the history of schools that income, I know we have to think about inflation, but that there would be fewer needs, right? In essence, there's never been a moment where we needed more resources to address the needs of students. If you look at the requirements, it looks, next to impossible to have full classes, full complements of every student in school at the same moment in time from a public health perspective. That triggers a number of financial implications and decisions that have to be made, right? There's a number of models that have come out saying, well, should we do an every other day of school model? And I've seen that. There's been other models and other writers who have been saying, well, we should prioritize elementary students to be in school as much as possible because their access to distance learning is reduced, and the implications of not getting foundational skills may last longer than older students who maybe have more access. Then there's the financial impact on the communities that, if 6-year-olds are in school every other day, that means many people can't go to work because most people don't work every other day schedules. That's more on your end of the things, especially Mike, than mine, more into education. But, I think the models are so diverse that are out there that I think there's, one of the terms I used a number of times last night is there's going to have to be some forced choices and choices that we haven't had to make before as school districts. And some of that's financial and some of that's just space, right? It's, that's going to be its own unique challenge. So I don't know if you had any thoughts about not a solution, but even how to start thinking about when we have these forced choices from the research, what are the types of things that you think would be the highest yield for all students, but particularly focused, as we talked about the educational debt and achievement gap that I know both of you care deeply about. Certainly in my district, it's a priority. How do we manage those, and how do we juggle those when we have some forced choices to be making in the next couple of months? And I think this gets to just commenting. One of the questions came up was really thinking about families already asking the district and looking at private schools, and I think that could also have implications from an equity front as well. And what are the constraints that the public schools have that private schools don't, and vice versa. So very long-winded question or comment to get the conversation going, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on those things. Sorry, it was a mouthful. I apologize.
Yeah, sorry. Go ahead, Katie.
I was just going to say there's in public policy, there's one of the models of thinking about how policies get enacted makes the point that you often, ideally, you would start with the problem and then compare different potential solutions and choose the solution based on some rational criteria. But politics often doesn't work that way. And what you often have is advocates and policy entrepreneurs who've had their favorite idea, since 1994, and they're just, this is the idea that they think will solve education's problems. So, and I've even noticed this tendency in myself. I'll think, oh, the pandemic is a perfect opportunity to do this thing that I think schools should be doing anyway. And so, Mike Morris, I'm sure you're going to be getting a lot of these emails from different companies that say, we have the solution, hire us now more than ever. And, Michael Lovenheim, you could, help us mobilize economists to help understand how we might make some of these decisions, but there's probably not data to make a lot of these decisions either.
Right. I think that's a big point. Right.
Yeah.
I think that's we're in really uncharted territory, and we can extrapolate the best we can from existing evidence, right? But the existing evidence on what happens when every kid in America or in the world misses, X months of school, well, that hasn't happened before. So you can extrapolate it from specific events where kids have missed, snow days, or they're out of school, not usually in the US, but in other countries, from strikes, or from closing of school districts for whatever reasons. For there have been some experiences like that in the US, around desegregation many years ago. So, there are bits and pieces of evidence here, right? You can look at, New Orleans post-Katrina, right? So, but they're really hard to extrapolate to the scope that we're talking about in this environment. So that makes it very hard to just say, oh, I've looked at the data and the research, and this is what we say to do. I mean, I think anyone who comes at you with that kind of certainty, you should be very concerned about. But at the same time, we need to do something. And so,
right. There's an ongoing debate when you think about federal education policy about should the federal government be more or less prescriptive with states and districts about how they're supposed to spend the money. And as somebody who studied desegregation a lot, I think my gut impulse is always that the federal government should put pretty strict limits on how states and localities are going to spend the money, or else, districts that never wanted to integrate their schools anyway are just going to take the money and do something else with it if the federal government isn't prescriptive. But I feel like this is one of the few moments where I've ever really felt wholeheartedly like fewer strings are better coming from the federal government, because it's a mess, and it's a mess that looks different in different places. And I don't think any U.S. Department of Education would have a shot at knowing more about what a particular school district really needs to spend its money on. But then this particular U.S. Department of Education has been in some disarray with staffing and turnover and reorganizations. And so now does feel like a good time to lean more on the locals and not worry about the precedent that it might be setting.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, the federal government, I mean, you guys know this, but I think some of the listeners might not know as much about this, that the federal government actually has very little statutory authority over education, or
right.
K-12 education in particular. And so they don't have a ton of ways of attaching strings to things, although they're providing money, that's, they can exercise power through the purse, which they do repeatedly in a lot of different ways. And so, on one hand, I agree, I think it would be unfortunate if the policy responses to this took on everyone's pet theory about what we should do to reorganize the education system, and it's kind of all over the place and ideological, and that's, I think, problematic. And so I think general funds are very important with fewer strings attached. However, I do think the federal government could pretty easily say, okay, to get this money, you have to submit plans for how you're going to make up the lost time, right? And so in that way, they can make sure that states are using it generally in the ways that we think it should be used. And saying, you deliver education the way you deliver education, use this money to do it. We just need more of it. And I think in that way, it would be a pretty flexible system, but also with some oversight attached. And that might be a nice type of balance. But it's a hard problem. And you don't want, you want big solutions, but you don't want it to get mired in politics and partisanship, which is very challenging.
So I'll turn this to you, Mike, since you live in New York State and Katie and I don't. So I'll let you have the first crack at this question. It was really a perfect segue, so thank you. So thoughts on Cornell partnering with Gates to optimize education solutions, and some pros and cons, and how you think about that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a pedagogy person, so I don't know a ton about that. I mean, I think public-private partnerships have a long history in this country and throughout the world, and there's been some really positive examples of partnerships between the public sector and the private sector. What you don't want is this to just be turned into a kind of a platform for Microsoft, right? So in Microsoft products, I use Zoom all the time, but it's so I think that is one danger one can think about, but in some sense the problems we face are so dramatic that I really feel like this is an all hands on deck situation, and to the extent that the private sector can be mobilized to help us solve some of these problems, I don't think that means turning over the education system to the private sector, or turning over all online platforms to Bill Gates, right? And so in some sense the devil's in the details here, as it kind of always is. But I do think there's a role for the private sector, absolutely, in a big role potentially, right? And I think it just depends specifically how it's used. I will admit, you called me out on this, Mike, but I don't know enough about the specifics of that partnership. But right. After this question, I'm going to go learn more about it. But I think just in general, this is a society-wide problem, and we need society-wide solutions. Historically in our country, when we've had society-wide problems, it has not just been one sector of society that has dealt with those problems, right? It has been a public-private partnership and all hands on deck, right? And that's been actually a very fruitful way to approach these problems. I think this is exactly the same, right? And so in that sense, I don't think we should look away from any potential solution or anyone or any organization that can help, but we also just need to be careful that we're approaching problems in a way that mitigate fraud and getting back to the last answer, that make sure we're really solving problems and not just doing pet policy projects, right? And I think that sometimes is a fine line, but that's really what we want. But I absolutely think the private sector has a big role to play here, and that we should not shy away from using them in and allowing them to play that role.
And also community organizations. There was a great article in last week's New Yorker by Gian Tolentino about mutual aid organizations in communities. And I mean, that particular kind of private sector is as strapped as the public sector is right now in terms of resources. But, imagining a community where, parents are still working full time and maybe the kids are on some kind of funky split shift at school, it would be great if a Boys and Girls Club or a YMCA or, anything could be stepping up to provide some of the other socialization and childcare and all the other services that the kids need. And it would be great to have communities have an opportunity to build their own capacity, use the capacity that they've got, and build their capacity moving forward, so that it's not, yet another thing that comes in from outside at them.
Yeah.
I agree.
Just as a note, I put a link to the CDC guidance, because I know I referenced it a couple times, and Katie did as well. So that link is on the chat feature for everybody. So there's This is a perfect segue. There's a next comment was about the equity and what would it look like if we prioritize a democratic society as well as individual achievement. And I think that's one of the questions we're doing well on time. We were going to talk about, which is what are the likely achievement gap educational debt impacts. We've touched on that one a couple times, but we haven't talked more explicitly about what policies might be able to be used to mitigate the disparities that have only grown over the last couple months and may continue to grow until we're back, whenever that date is. So I'll send that off to both of you guys. I'll share my own thoughts about that from practitioner lens, but I'd love to give you an opportunity to jump into that.
Well, thinking specifically about civic learning, there's a pretty decent evidence base in political science that talks about the effects that the ways that policies are delivered to people can affect the messages that people get about the government and about their own worthiness to participate in the government. And one of the classic like administrative burden is one of the issues that comes up here, that if you're getting say Social Security, retirement income through this relatively simple process where you've been paying in your whole working life, and then the checks start to come after you retire and you don't have to go prove that you're worthy, contrasted at the other extreme with some of the, say, aggressively means-tested experiments that states are doing now, some states with Medicaid, where you have to prove that you're meeting a work participation requirement in order to participate in Medicaid, and you have to recertify every 4 weeks, and it's a big administrative load. In addition to the administrative load, apparently over time, if you look at the research, people internalize this message of they don't trust me, I don't trust them, the system isn't working for me. So on top of everything else that schools are thinking about, I think the kinds of messages that they're sending to families and to kids will help them either feel more or less included in some public project that they can continue to participate in.
Yeah, I service delivery is not one of my areas of expertise. I mean, I agree with everything Katie was saying. I think as well, like part of this problem, there's two problems here, right? One is about the educational, the learning, right? The academic aspects, and in some sense the social aspects of schools, right? Those are important. So put that in one bin. The other is we actually run an enormous amount of redistributive social programs through schools, right? Mm-hmm. And actually, normally that's great, right? Because if you want to target programs to schools, that's where children are. So it makes a lot of sense to do that from a delivery mechanism. It's just this pandemic has created unique challenges to doing that, right? So health programs, run through schools. There's a lot of schools in this country that have school-based health centers that, where that's where children receive their primary care services, right? School lunches, right? That's a well-known program, right? Where we're delivering nutrition to kids, right? So there's all these programs we run through mental health services, right? Guidance counseling. So like these are very, very important services that we run through schools. And the absence of those services right now are again going to have a disproportionate impact on low-income kids, not only because they're the ones who are most likely to use these services, but also because their families are the ones who can't supplement with, private market replacements, right? And so I think so. Maybe to go back to the original question, like so the gaps are going to be, I think, just exacerbated. What policies? I think it really, a lot of that depends too on how long we're out of school, right? So if we can start up again in the fall in a meaningful way, the very short-term policy responses might need to be less dramatic, just because we're in summer almost, and like we're only talking about a couple months now until we can start up. And I think a lot of the service delivery of things like things like school lunches, right, which are very important, have been addressed to some extent by many school districts. I don't know what the variation is across schools, but from the schools I know about, they've been really proactive in this. I think like the real concern I have is what happens if we're not in school in the fall, and I think everyone just started to sweat a little bit, but if that's when I start to think like we're going to need to figure out ways of delivering these kinds of services to students. Not just the educational services, but the other services as well, through Zoom, through small group meetings, maybe having individual service providers, going to specific houses, but that has dangers as well. I mean, it's a very challenging problem. And I think in some sense, step one is to be aware of it. I don't have I wish I just had like the thing I could snap my fingers and say, this is what we should do. Anyone who's ever met an economist isn't shocked that I can't say that, but I mean, it's honest, but I do think we need to look it in the eye and say, this is a huge set of problems, and we can incur the costs of shifting our social programs, some of these social programs outside of the schools, right? But that's costly too. And so, if we do that, then when schools reopen, why do we incur those costs for a short amount of time? So I think a lot of what we do really depends on how long we're out of school. And so then, it's related to the underlying public health issues.
Yeah, I think I'll just jump in from the practitioner lens is that what I think many districts have found, my own included, is that in a virtual environment, the disparities that pre-existed COVID-19 in our country have been exacerbated. And I think, like many districts, we've done, like our parent organization raised money, and we have mobile hotspots. So, internet access is significantly less of an issue than it was a month ago. Chromebooks and our staff, food service, we're at like 35,000 lunches, right? So I think some of those core pieces, like many districts, we've put in place. I think the larger kind of the issue that keeps folks like me up at night is on the learning side, and the mental health side, right? You addressed that, Mike. But so, I think you're right. And I think, one of the things I've learned from some of the articles that you've sent me, looking at, like there was one about Argentina where students were out of school for a long time, the lifelong impacts it had for elementary age students who missed months of school, and also the social mobility impact of that. And so, I think there's no doubt that COVID-19 is a public health crisis, but it's also an educational crisis that
Yes.
will have long legs if we don't, collectively, and I don't mean the three of us or even people on this call, but collectively, don't take some real strong action steps to try to address that. So, again, districts like mine can take small action steps relative to the context of having high quality tutoring for students who are more likely to be negatively impacted by the closure. And we're doing that in the summer. And I think there's going to be a lot of value to that, and I'm not trying to minimize that at all. But we're talking about a multi-year, incredibly complex problem that will need both, financial resources, which we talked quite a bit about, but also technical resources. If you thought about how many districts there are in Massachusetts, which is a lot, just if you've ever been to Massachusetts, there's a lot of small districts, all trying to figure out exactly how to manage that question. It's a huge one. And one thing we decided not to focus on today, just based on time, was the issue of students with special needs. And students whose learning needs cannot access, because of their learning needs and disability, accessing, modifying, or doing accommodations for the curriculum don't necessarily flow as well in a virtual environment. And how to make up is the wrong paradigm, because I don't actually think that's right. But how do we best support those students on reentry is going to be the challenge. And I think, perhaps one, I'm always the silver linings person. You both know me a little bit, so I always do. But, when I look at the CDC guidance and I say 10 to 12 students in class, there's a little piece of me that says, if we can figure out how to do that right, particularly for our most vulnerable learners, is there a little bit of space where, if we can do it, that they're getting the same level of quality instruction in a smaller group setting and more individualized attention than they would get in another setting? The challenge is we can't do classes of 10 to 12 students every day for the 2,600 students pre-K to 12 in my district. So that's where we get to some forced choices and some uncomfortable conversations. I think hit on some of the politics that, my colleague in Northampton, John Provost, mentioned earlier is, how do you make these decisions? And, we live in I'm not elected, I'm appointed, but I operate in a political sphere, whether I like it or not. And you could guess whether I like it, but that's my reality. And so I think anything that you could offer, not necessarily on the spot, although if you do, is just how do we make decisions that are in, for the greater good, and if we're going to have to prioritize some things over other things, we need some rationale and some basis for it. And hopefully not swayed solely by public opinion, because we know that public opinion doesn't necessarily capture the needs of all students equally or equitably.
And I mean, that's why we have the legal protections in federal and state law for students with disabilities.
Yeah.
You know, knowing that that's by definition a minority of the population, and one that might not be looked out for as well if they didn't have these guarantees. So I guess as much as as somebody who's trying to figure out how to get an academic department in a university up and running in the fall, I really kind of hope that we manage to make K-12 school happen in the fall, since it's inadvertently a kind of a linchpin. It's not meant to be a linchpin of the rest of the economy, but if you have young kids, it actually is.
Absolutely.
If we do have to have some students in school and some students out of school, maybe the students who have disabilities, students who are English language learners, maybe they get more school than others do at the outset, just because of there are certain disability, certain kinds of education that kids with disabilities need that you can't do over Zoom. They're students who are learning English maybe need more time in school speaking English with people than they would get if they weren't in school. So that would be one possible way of thinking about it. But it's, again, none of this is going to be fun. I feel like I'm embodying the worst stereotype of social scientists as the people who gallop down onto the battlefield after the war is over and shoot the wounded. But there's, it is truly an unprecedented situation that we're in, with unprecedented challenges.
Yeah, well, I'll say on a positive note, and then I'll let Mike jump in before we transition to our last topic. I think the thing that I've appreciated, at least what I can say locally here, is that the community has really bared with us, and they highly understand the nature of a pandemic is different than anything that we've had before. And so I think the patience of the community has been really helpful. I think when we're making our next tier of decisions, that's going to be a different level of focus. And something that I tell the two comments that my people work with me would say, I tell them all the time. One is that this is an imperfect situation. We're going to have imperfect solutions. So this kind of like theory that we're going to be able to meet everybody's needs and desires, I don't think that's going to happen. I think the second thing is, right now is the easiest time we'll have for the next year. And I don't think it's the best time. I think we want kids and teachers in school. I come to my office once a week. It's not my favorite part of the week, because it's sad to be in a school where no one else is there. Very few people else are there. And I think, I know the learning loss the first hour of our conversation, and yet the decision trees get much more complicated after this. But I'm sorry, Mike, you were going to.
No, not at all. No, I think let me just reemphasize something you said earlier, which is I really believe the long run legacy of this pandemic is going to be felt through the education system and the lost learning that students have if we don't do enough, right? Yeah. And not just something, but enough, right? And that's hard. I totally agree. I mean, I like Katie, run an academic department, and like whenever you have to make policies in this environment, it's very clear, right? There are no good policies. Some are worse than others, but it's not like, and the reason is we're just in a really bad situation, right? Not of any of our making, but it's a bad situation. And so all of our policies are going to reflect the fact that we are in a very challenging environment right now, right? And so, we're really choosing between, policies that we hope never to have to choose between, right? That if you told me 6 months ago I'd have to choose between them, I'd be like, you're crazy. What's about to happen, right? I don't think any of us expected to be in this environment. And again, it's not like, it's not like, Mike, you messed up as superintendent and now the schools are closed for 4 months, right? Like that didn't happen, right? So, but it's like, it's not anyone's fault, right? This is just, it happened. And so, or at least it's not any local policymaker's fault. Let's put it that way. So like it happened. So I think that makes it, on the one hand, very challenging to do policy. On the other hand, as we've talked about before, the three of us, there's a freeing aspect of it as well, where like you can do things in here where, you're not setting precedent, because we're hopefully not going to be in this situation again, right? And so, I think in terms of choosing between difficult policies, I guess the one big thing I'd say is maybe an obvious point, but one that's probably worthwhile to keep saying, which is that the more resources schools have, the less they're going to have to make these really awful decisions, right? And if the money scene is really important. I'm not just saying that as an economist, but it's true, right? Because imagine schools didn't lose a cent of tax dollars or state funding throughout this crisis, right? That your budget next year would be exactly what you would have expected it to be, in October of of last year, right? So, but then this crisis happens. It still would be, you would be woefully underfunded, right? Because you're going to need to do things like have 10-person classes and potentially multiple bus runs. And I don't, there's a lot of different things, but the point is that all of the things that need to happen, not to mention, by the way, extended school days and, or extended school years, these are in addition to, right? And states have balanced budget amendments. They don't have money laying around to do this. It's not because they've been fiscally mismanaged. It's because why would they have the money laying around to do this, right? Like, they're not just sitting on reserves in case they have to spend, $20 billion on this or something, right? So, and same with school districts. So I think it's the point is that more money is needed because we need extraordinary things. We're in an extraordinary position. We need extraordinary policies that are not inexpensive, right? And so the difficulty of the choices people are going to have to face are going to be smaller when districts are properly resourced to handle the challenges that they have.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. And for me, I'll just, before we transition to our last topic on assessment and accountability, for me, one of the things I've gotten from our multiple conversations, not necessarily just today, is trying to think through what are the long-term implications of the decision we're making. Even though if there's not a great economic base, there's enough articles that both of you have shared with me that at least open the door to be able making a research-informed decision. Some of the information, even about like virtual schools and who they work best for, and by age level, by disability, right? There is research out there to help guide some of our thinking about this. And I think the temptation of making decisions in the short term seem logical because we all hope this is a short-term problem, but the implications of the decisions, the Argentina paper really strikes out at me about, teacher strikes and that have lifelong impacts and have impacts on social mobility, which is why most of us got into this business of K-12 education to begin with. So I think therein lies the challenge of how to make the best decisions that aren't just the short-term, we'll get through decisions, but have a defensible point of view that looks at that long-term piece. And that's something I've gotten out of the conversations we've had is just you're able to do, share with me long-term research, longitudinal research studies that show results, and those aren't things I readily have at my disposal. So, I'm deeply appreciative of that, and that's how I'm going to attempt to walk through this. And the nature is it's a political process, and the community is going to have to come to some conclusions. We'll probably start talking about this in my local community in earnest next month once we get budgets passed. And that'll be the next thing, is starting to have community dialogue about this. And I do think from a policy perspective, something that I know I've learned from Katie, not just in our dialogues, but took courses with Katie in the past, is just the sooner you get the dialogue going, the better the policy potentially is at the end. If you start with the policy without the dialogue, policy might be the best policy. But if it's a good policy, it doesn't pass, not implemented, it's not. It looks great on paper, right? And so that's how we intend to try to work on it, and we'll see where we land.
So no, I think I do think that you made the nailed the point, which is like education has long run benefits to individuals in society, kind of across the board, right? And that just underscores the urgency of this problem, because if we just are like, it's hard, forget it, whatever. 30 years from now, we're going to look back and say, gee, I really wish we had done something, like this is a real mess, right? But it'll be too late. And so, we need to pay attention to it when we can do something about it. And the returns to it, it's an investment, right? We need to make sure we're properly investing in our future now, despite the challenges posed by this pandemic. Or else, we're going to be disappointed later that we didn't do it.
Yep. So good comment. I worry about the discourse about loss of learning, and I wonder how we can lift up the things that students are learning at home that are also of value. And so I want to be clear from my perspective anyway, that I think the distance learning has been of value. And I've seen that both in my role as parent as well as my role as superintendent. I think the challenge is that it's a different type of learning. And depending on the age of student, based on the disability learning status, learning style, we have students who are essential workers. and they can't always be accessible for the contacts at the high school because they're working. We have students who are taking care of siblings, and so their access to the curriculum is limited. And schools aren't perfect, and I'll be the first to say that, but there is some leveling about having 1,000 students at a high school all simultaneous in courses that's not replicable, in my personal opinion, in the current environment. So I think it's a good reminder about loss of learning and being more explicit in the language that I'm using. So I appreciate that, and I do think there's ways to talk about this that don't have a deficit model. And I don't want to also minimize the impact that that's going to have for students' academic readiness. And I think those of you know Amherst, we take kind of the social emotional lens and the whole child lens very, very seriously. And our social justice commitments, and I know the person writing this as an expert in this area, mean that we care about social mobility. We're here so that we give a high quality education to every single student, and then we give every single student choices that they can make as they leave us, as Katie's is doing very soon, youngest that she referenced, doing very soon. And so anything that's a barrier to that is something that we work on, and that's how we approach it. And I guess the concern is that this spring has created barriers that may have already existed, but it's built them up to be larger, and that's what we want to address. But I really appreciate the question.
And also the things that students might be learning at home during the pandemic that aren't academic. Maybe they're even younger kids. Some of them are having to step up more, or their parents have decided to make this a learning opportunity to step up more with learning how to help manage the house or take care of their younger siblings, or, mow the lawn, or, all the different things that parents might be in the habit of doing for their kids that they don't have as much time to do, can also be a way that kids learn self-efficacy, that, I did this important stuff that helped my family.
Right. Yeah. And I would say, the loss of learning, I also worry, Katie gave some positive examples, but I really worry about, and our Department of Children and Families in Massachusetts is deeply concerned about the low level of reporting of abuse.
Yeah.
So I don't mean to be the negative person, but on the flip side, we have a whole number of students in a whole variety of neighborhoods and a whole variety of areas who are not having, not that cutting the lawn is a lovely experience, but not having those, experiences that one can say might be formative in a positive way. And so, we worry about the trauma that all students are experiencing from the quarantine, but also what is the experience, and the kind of some of the disparities that already existed have been exacerbated by this, as the level of stress for our families has gone up incredibly. And the most affected families in our district, and as well as the country, tend to be families who already had stressors going on. So in our area, there's a major industry is hotels and restaurants. That area has been decimated. That sector has been decimated by this the last couple of months. As Katie knows, and the university doesn't have students, and they're an economic, a huge economic player in our area. And so I think some of the worry too is the level of stress on families and the inability. Our counselors are reaching out and doing it, but for students not being able to get out of their house and in an environment with another adult, for some of them, it's been very challenging.
Yeah, the evidence from the Great Recession was that educational inequality increased because of the funding issues, and also the disproportionate effect of economic downturns on disadvantaged families. Yeah. And this is going to be like that, but more so. And so that I think that's some kids are learning a lot. And teachers are working really hard. I hope nothing I said was suggestive that this is because, people aren't working hard or don't care about the students or anything. It's not that. It's just a really hard environment to teach in. Some kids are learning a lot and getting a lot out of it, and are in, great home environments and might actually like this more, but there are a lot of kids who are not in that environment and who are being adversely affected. And then again, we all come back together in the school and hopefully the fall, and then we have to think about how to teach kids that are even more variable in terms of their academic achievement levels than they were beforehand. And I think it was a serious challenge beforehand. It's even more of a serious challenge now, unfortunately. Yeah.
And so we're running out of time. So I'll just, my segue to talk a little bit about accountability is, what my 6-year-old son has learned is how to pick locks. It's one of the things he's learned. He's learned a tremendous amount. teachers have been wonderful, and that's authentic. It's not just because
You had not told me that before. That is fantastic.
Yeah. So kids are learning all sorts of different things. He's learning math, he's learning reading, but that's what kids learn perhaps when they're in a house and adults have to do work and there's locks, and he's figured out multiple ways. Those are young kids. He can now pick locks with Bakugan characters. So that's his new learning this week. And so heading to accountability, just any thoughts you have quickly, and then we'll open up for more questions in chat. We'll end on time at 3:30. But about how even to start thinking about assessment and accountability as we move forward. This is obviously a much larger topic than a 9-minute conversation, but at least some initial thoughts that you might have that might be helpful for people to hear.
I'd say we need to keep assessing, both in probably particularly the kinds of assessments that teachers have always done in the classroom to get a sense of whether what they're teaching is getting through or the students learning. I've thought a lot about large-scale accountability policy, and I've got to say I don't see a lot of point in attaching consequences to state testing, even when state testing starts up again next year. I think suspending it this spring was absolutely the right call. There might be an argument for not testing again next year. If you can do it in a way that doesn't disrupt the school day any more than the school day will already be disrupted next year just because of what else is going on, I think it would be worth doing the assessments. But I'll be blunt, I think it would be malpractice to hold any teachers accountable for their kids' test scores. There's some problematic ways of doing that are in use now anyway. But even if we had a perfect way of doing it, I think next year will not be the year to reinstate that, because who knows what's gone into the kids' learning when they're assessed next year.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I probably buy the validity of some of these statistical models surrounding teacher assessment or accountability more than you do, Katie. But but even aside from that, like the whole point is that in this environment, there's just no way you could take students' test scores and meaningfully attach them to the behavior of a teacher, right? And that's what accountability is about, or a school, right? Is to say we're going to use data from test scores or other assessments, and trying to tease out what's the causal effect of the school or the teacher on that learning. There's just no way to do that right now. I mean, I just don't think anyone, even the most hardcore accountability people, maybe I'll hear from some of them after this, but I think they would also agree that this is not, it's wouldn't be fruitful, because you wouldn't believe any of the data you'd get out of this at all. But I do agree that assessment's critically important, right? We need to know where students are so that we can teach them appropriately, right? And the only way to do that, I think, is to have some assessment. But I think it needs to be done with care so that there's not even an attempt or a veneer that these are going to be used for accountability. So I think doing assessment and pausing accountability is the right way to do this for at least the next couple of years.
And I think it's going to be a big test for policymakers at the state levels, not just my own in Massachusetts. I think there's so much angst and disagreement about the topics that you both shared your own, at least relative to the larger disagreement, a minor disagreement about. How flexible are people going to be? And I think that's actually a critical, generalizable question. How much of our historic and even recent policy decisions about things like accountability are people willing to say, this doesn't make sense in this context, or we have to rethink that given what happened? And I guess my fear on a practitioner level is that it's easier for some people, and I'm not talking about my Department of Education or anyone else's, but as a human being, it's easiir when you have systems set up to okay, I'll make this fit my system.
Yeah.
Right. And there's some inertia, and I face that myself, right? I'm involved in local policy making, and how we all can get away from that sort of thing. I think that thinking will actually have long-term negative impacts on both teachers and students if we try to fit, our existing procedures, practices, and just translate them to this environment. I actually think it really, this isn't my own policy. I'm not trying to reinvent things like you talked about before. I don't have a policy in mind, but I think as a paradigm, trying to just say, oh yeah, we'll definitely do MCAS. It's gonna be the same. Yeah, there's some convenience to that, right? There's a policy perspective that accountability is important. So I get that. I don't think it actually fits the context that we're going to be in. And
I agree.
So my fear on a local level is that policymakers won't actually make the changes that they'll need to make this whole operation be appropriate for students and in this case teachers.
And they'll definitely and they'll need to listen to people in jobs like yours too, because you're the ones who can say, no, with the CDC social distancing guidelines in effect in schools, if we add in the logistical challenges of a large scale assessment on top of that, we're going to have, we need three more buildings to make that work, and we don't have 3 more buildings. So,
but I think like I think assessment's important. Okay, I'm sorry. I do think assessment's important. I think accountability is important too, right? So I very much believe, in accountability systems, but I believe in meaningful accountability systems.
Right.
We shouldn't just do it to do it. We should do it because when we believe that we have methods of actually gleaning information about what schools and teachers and stuff are doing, then it becomes informative. And I think the point is, if you think accountability is important, I think you need to recognize that you can't do it correctly in this environment, right? And so, like what we could do it because we just think it's important, but like then you're actually undermining the whole idea, which is that these should be meaningful measures, right? That we should use. And yeah, it's unfortunate we can't do accountability, but a lot of stuff's unfortunate. So I just don't see, a way around it. We can't invent a way around the problem that, it's just not possible to really attach learning gains, over the last couple of years to teachers or schools right now because of all of the disruptions that have happened.
Yeah, and I think we just have a couple minutes left, so I'll see if there's questions come in. But I think on that topic, what we've learned so far has been, what I've learned so far has been from a policy perspective, policymakers are all overwhelmed by this, myself included, right? And yourselves probably included as well, about the number of things we have to rethink, and doesn't feel like things are coming fast enough. I'll say like guidance for fall. I would have liked to have that 2 weeks ago from Desi.
Me too.
Right.
So, right. I mean, I don't know what Cornell's going to look like in the fall either, right? So right. And I'm sure UMass, same thing. So,
yeah. And so I think one thing is to have, a term that Mike used in an earlier conversation was to have humility, that we don't have this all mapped out because it's not map outable as quickly as we need it to be. And everyone I know in terms of folks at DESE, they're working incredibly hard, our state and Department of Education. And if you were designing a State Department of Education to handle this crisis, you would design it very differently than their department is currently designed, right? You'd have more people, you'd have differentiated roles, right? And so I think that's a real challenge, at the state level, but the same challenge sort of applies at the local level as well. So I think having that humility, I think, is going to be incredibly important as we walk through this. Involving stakeholders is going to be incredibly important. And then at the end of the day, trying to make the best decisions for the long-term impact or interests of our students. And, I think you're right, 30 years from now, there's going to be a lot of good papers for you all to write, and you're all different researchers. So both qualitative and quantitative papers. I think about who did this right. But I think, one of the things I've gathered from our conversations is just really thinking through decisions, both in the short and the long term. There is research out there, and you've shared many, many links with me. I put some of them on Twitter and everything that have been really impactful to help us think about, how to think about this, which is the first challenge. Again, it's thinking about this the same way we've thought about other challenges in the past is not necessarily going to yield the result that we want to get, because the same problem-solving mechanics can't be used. The context is so different.
Yeah.
So before we close, I don't know if there's anything either of you want to share at the end of the stream.
It's just been, a great break from having to think about all the nuts and bolts that I think about every day to be able to think more broadly about this moment that we're in, because, all my life reading history, I've always wondered, do people know that they're living through a big historical moment when they're living through it? And now I know the answer is that for the first 3 weeks, no, you don't.
That's clear.
But we're there now, right?
Yeah, that's right. No, and I'd say that, I think that the thing that gives me some hope here that we can solve some of these problems is I actually think, regardless of one's political persuasion, we all have the same goal here, which is we want our kids to have skills and knowledge and to learn and to have good schools. And so, like the outcomes that we all want here, I think, are pretty uniform and, or not uniform, we probably agree on them. And so then the question is how to get there, right? And so I think that's a very important and challenging conversation, but it's an easier conversation than what do we even want, right? That's a values statement. I think people's values are probably pretty similar here, and we face some really, really dramatic and unprecedented policy challenges, but I'm hopeful that we'll be able to get around them, but we need to meet them. But we need to kind of start talking about it and really be proactive about it, right? Because the other part of me, the more negative part of me, worries that we're just going to be reactive, and then because the costs of not handling this problem are going to be felt so far in the future that we'll never get our act together about it. Yeah. And so I think we really need to, as a society, kind of take a look at this and say we need to do something now. And so hopefully that'll happen.
Yeah, I'll just share to Katie's point about when we knew this was going to be history. So, and this was covered in depth in a WBUR article, so I won't go into the gory details, but superintendents of Massachusetts had a conference call in the morning of Friday, March 13th. At that point, some schools in Eastern Massachusetts had closed temporarily for the pandemic. Nobody in Western Mass, to my knowledge or my recollection, maybe one district had closed, not too many. And we had a conference call and with the state and with Department of Public Health. And the night before, I knew this call was coming. And, all the signs, the colleges were already closing. And the signs were that was going to be the smart thing to do. And I sort of had built up this expectation. I'm going to get in this conference call, a decision made for me. I mean, I'd already scripted out, how we were going to make this announcement. And this isn't to knock on the state or knock on the guidance we got. I think it's just an instructive story. So the guidance we got was, you don't need to close yet. We're still looking at information. And then Department of Public Health got on. They said this is a critical moment in the growth of, the virus. And and my plans, more or less, I was texting my colleagues in Western Mass, and we got on a conference call directly afterwards and talked about what where different people were. And so, we went forward with our plan to announce closures that day. It ended up on Sunday when I think there was like maybe one district that wasn't closed. The state closed all the schools across the Commonwealth. But the way we closed was I did a video rather than ask all these teachers who didn't know this was coming to explain this to kids. We thought that was, I thought that was a bad idea, right? It's just unfair to teachers to be asking them to, you get this big news, you're closed for a couple of weeks and you have to explain to kids. So I did a video, we did it with the colleagues, we did English and Spanish. And so I knew it was a big deal at the time because your closing schools hadn't happened before. We really thought about it. And about a week or two later, I was in my neighborhood with my daughter on a bike ride. And someone's like, oh, that's the guy from the video. It was a high school student who I didn't know, right? And you're like, oh, wow, maybe this is a bigger deal than I realized at the moment. We're just like, that's the right thing to do. I don't want to position folks awkwardly to have to explain. They haven't been on the conference calls I have with Department of Public Health, right? It feels like a way to get a common message out. And so, when my kids kind of looked at me, my son and wife, they're like, what video, and they both had seen it, but they're like, whatever, he's on the public access all the time for school committee. And so, how kids are thinking about it, how parents are thinking about it, it crystallized for me that we are in this moment in history where there's so much uncertainty. And I think there are moments for leaders, both in the researcher level and the practitioner level, to be able to be out there and to facilitate dialogue for communities to make the best decisions. And I think the reason I tell the story is I've really appreciated both this dialogue today, but also all the dialogue we've had on the front end. And I think we should do more of it, whether it's this format or I continue to pick your brains in a less public format. But hopefully it engenders more dialogue out there about how to approach this and how to move forward. And I think, the next big topic is going to be fall, and we'll be doing a session on that in my district a couple of weeks from now. I said to get the 3rd at 3:30. We'll have, from a mental health perspective, how to talk about it, but we'll be having a lot of public conversations in June. And I think having the research panel, being able to run things, by folks like yourself who have different access to resource materials and research materials has been a real benefit of mine. I think it's going to benefit the students the more we do it. So very long-winded way of saying thank you tremendously for all your support and your health. And thanks for being on the call. And thanks for everyone for spending, if you live in East Coast, a pretty nice day with us. And thanks for all the comments and questions as well.
Yeah, thank you. This has really, really been great. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, take care.